This video is purely educational. It does not promote or depict real money play. No real hands are shown.
The red line is one of the most misunderstood things in poker. It sucks because most people have a red line that looks something like this. Usually when people think about the red line, they think about bluffing, but defending has an equal if not greater impact. This video is a full big blind defense masterclass, all centered around one goal: to get your red line from something that looks like this to something that looks like this, and maybe even something that looks like this. It's not a process that happens overnight, but this video will teach you so many necessary concepts to really take you down this path of improving your red line. Big blind defense specifically has a massive effect on the red line because it's the most common formation in poker, and it's a spot where most players do not know when to give up and when to fight back. In fact, there are 3 key mistakes that players make as big blind that cause their red line to suffer. Before we start, I want to mention that all of the material in this video is sourced directly from Savant's latest course, which has everything to do with big blind defense. I'll talk about it a bit later, but I really urge you to try this course out for free if you haven't already on the Savant website. I also want to mention that everything here exclusively focuses on strategies against regular players. The philosophy is that if big blind can play well against them, then big blind is in great shape overall, because it's not difficult for big blind to play well against weaker players. But let's get straight to business and cover those 3 big mistakes that kills players' red lines. The first very common and detrimental mistake that players make is overfolding on rivers after calling on the turn. This one sort of forms the basis of what we're going to talk about in this video, so it's very important to understand. It is best demonstrated with an example. In this case, we're looking at big blind facing a medium-sized turn barrel from button, and this is a spot where it's really common to see players call with this hand on the turn and then fold on the river. Now, the turn thought process might vary, but usually when I encounter this sort of spot, people will tell me that the reason they called on the turn might be because they want to see how the hand plays out. It might be because they don't feel like overfolding and playing way too nitty overall. But whatever the reason is, you have to understand that it is a massive mistake for the red line to call with this hand and then overfold on a neutral river. The reason why this is such a big mistake for the red line is because players will barrel too often on the river in this bet line. A hand like 9-7 does not want to face additional river bets, and especially if big blind plans on folding against that river bet, it means they are putting in too many chips on the turn to simply throw them away later in the hand. That is detrimental to the red line because the red line measures the non-showdown results. That's not to say that calling on the turn is never good. If big blind plans on calling down because they think button is a very bluffy type of player, then it's totally fine to call on the turn and to call on the river. In that case, it's the best move. In addition, there's many scenarios where it just makes sense to call on the turn and then fold on the river. An example could be when big blind is holding top pair. This hand is simply too strong to fold right now, but it will be indifferent against a big river bet. And one more scenario that frequently occurs is if big blind calls on the turn, but then encounters an unfavorable river card and thus decides to fold. For instance, if big blind calls here and it's a flush closing card, those tend to be a little bit worse for bluff catching, as we'll see later. Definitely fine for big blind to just fold on the river if they face a bet on that specific card. But the key mistake that players commonly make is simply calling on the turn and then folding on a neutral river card. I think the psychology of it is pretty insightful, and it does tie into mistake number 2 that I see players make from the big blind. That mistake can be stated as such: it is not knowing which factors are good for bluff catching. We'll spend a lot of time in this video talking about factors, and probably that's going to be the most valuable part of this video. When I'm talking about factors, I specifically mean things like texture and bet size and player type, because all of those are big data points that can significantly shift our bluff catching decision. Poker is a really tough game, and it takes a long time to learn those things. That's why I think it's so common for players to make this mistake of calling on the turn and then folding on the river, because if they don't have a clear picture of what to do a street ahead of time, then it's really easy to simply justify calling on the turn and delay that difficult decision until the river when the information's a bit more clear. But when you have the right knowledge and you're able to make that decision a street ahead of time, that's when the real magic happens. That's when the red line stops leaking so much, because a clear game plan simply beats an unstructured one. My hope is that by the end of the video, you will be able to look at any bluff catching spot and definitively, with laser-like precision, say if it's a good bluff catching spot or if it's a bad one. We'll talk about how to get there in just a quick second. Before we do that though, I think it's especially important to understand the third and final mistake that I catch players making. This mistake is not fighting back enough from the big blind, both in check call check bet and with flop check raises. At first, it seems like this mistake is a little bit distant from our previous point of discussion, which was all about defending against Cbets and barrels. But it really does tie in, because how we choose to defend against the flop Cbet strategy depends on these factors significantly. All that said and done, in this video, you will learn Big Blind's optimal defending strategy against Cbets and barrels, as well as how to fight back and really get that red line up. We're going to do that in a few steps. First and foremost, we will start with that defending against Cbets and barrels topic. To do this, we will identify what are good and bad spots for bluff catching, relying on mass data and theory. After we finish this first step, we will discuss 3 more game plan hacks for Big Blind Mastery. This will basically cover that final piece of the puzzle. It's all about fighting back in check call, check bet, and check raise lines. And finally, for our Discord members, I have an exclusive video which covers some additional check raising secrets directly taken from that last flagship course. You can get it for free by following the link down below. That one contains a lot of the premium content from Savant. With that said, let's dive into the most valuable part of this video, which covers exactly how to defend against Cbets and barrels. Let's get right into it. Especially when it comes to big blind defense, understanding the exploitative way to deviate is especially important because making bad bluff catching decisions can kill the red line, as we've seen. To understand what is the optimal exploitative way to play, we have to consider those factors that I briefly touched upon earlier. There's 3 main things we want to think about. The first one we want to think about is what is the impact of the board texture. This answers the question, what textures are good or bad for bluff catching? The second thing we want to consider is what is the impact of InPosition's bet sizing scheme. When you dig into mass data, you start to see some sizing tells in every single scheme, and it can really reveal a lot about the strength of InPosition's range. The final factor to consider is opponent profile. Opponent profile doesn't simply mean asking yourself, is this an aggressive opponent or is this a passive one? It also means, is this a spot where player profile matters? Or is this a spot where most players, regardless of profile, will overbluff or underbluff? This is something that's quite often overlooked, and I think it's one of the most interesting things from all of mass data analysis. But we'll take things step by step, starting with texture. I have a fun little made-up quote here. Texture tells the story. Problem is, some perps are fiction writers. This one's from Detective Ranges over at the Flop Crimes Division in New York. Board texture contains a lot of information in poker. Most good players will have reasonable pre-flop ranges, and we can thus at least semi-accurately estimate what their range looks like on any given board. This is where the effect of texture comes in, because not every board will interact with InPosition's range in the same way. In certain spots, players will have many more natural bluffs, and on others, they will lack them. And in some spots, players will value bet too thin, and in others, they will not value bet thin enough. And lastly, players will naturally be less inclined to bluff on some boards compared to others. All of these factors skew InPosition's range either more towards bluffs or more towards value. In theory, texture should not have a big impact for bluff catching as big blind. The thresholds might change, but big blind will always have some hands that are indifferent to bluff catching on the river. In practice, turns and rivers will vary wildly in expected value for bluff catching, so by carefully considering texture, big blind can make better decisions that apply in practice. For your convenience, I've compiled a powerful list of textures where bluff catching is a little bit better and where it's a little bit worse. We'll go over each texture one by one, and then we'll dive into some practical examples over at Savant. Starting off with the average board. This one is bet around 2% too often on the river, and there is a medium underbluff. It still depends a little bit on player type, and we'll talk about that later in this video. Next up are the high boards. These are also bet around 2% too often, and there's also a medium underbluff here. Following up with the low ones, there's a bit of a distinction between low dry boards and low connected ones, which I think is really important to remember. Your lower, drier boards will be bet at roughly the right frequency on the river, and there's only a small underbluff. So versus more aggressive opponents, it's totally fine for big blind to overcall. But if the board is lower and connected, data shows that regs barrel 5% too often, and there is a medium underbluff, which makes bluff catching significantly worse. Next up are paired flops, or boards which pair on the turn or on the river. These will be bet around 3% too often, but there is a big underbluff on the river. I think this one's especially interesting because data shows that regs overbluff on the flop if it is a paired board like 9-9 deuce, but the average player does not bluff often enough on the turn or on the river. Last up are our flush closing boards. These are bet 6% too often on the river, and there is also a big underbluff, which makes bluff catching a disaster. And that's as specific as I really want to get when we start talking about texture. We could always dive a little bit deeper and inspect how the interaction between different textures will affect bluff catching. For example, we might ask, what is the difference between a low board that is paired and is flush closing, compared to a high board that is paired and flush closing. But at this point, I think this is a little bit too specific to be useful. When you look at data this closely, there are two big problems. Number one is a lot of the findings stop making intuitive sense. In my experience, many seemingly similar textures will play out very differently from each other, and this likely either boils down to statistical error or the simple fact that boards that look very similar in theory can play out very differently, and thus players are prone to making different mistakes. Without going down the rabbit hole too much here, I want to point out that you need a rather sophisticated analysis method to extract any reliable findings from the data when you approach it with this level of specificity. This is not the right video for me to get into it, but if we just take a step back and look at things a little bit more broadly, then we can get some useful and reliable heuristics. My goal, especially with all this data, is to never box you in. It is to give you better tools to aid your decision-making process in-game. With that said, let's take a look at a few annotated solutions to really improve your decision-making process for a few specific common boards. We're going to jump back and forth between slides and annotated solutions over at Savant, taken directly from our latest flagship course. Let's start off with a high disconnected board because these are some of the most common ones in poker. We are currently looking at Queen 6-4, King 6. This is the first annotation, and it describes Big Blind's calling strategy against a small c-bet from button. We can hover over to 10-7 and click on this and see that on disconnected boards, Big Blind has to call really wide against small c-bets. Anything slightly connected calls, hands like 10-7 of clubs and Jack-10 with a diamond. I write about this in the previous articles in this course, but what we're really trying to figure out here is just how wide solver calls on a number of different flops. As we'll discuss later in the video, it's especially important to understand how the solver calls against smaller flop c-bets, because this directly ties into a big chunk of Big Blind strategy, which is fighting back in those check-raise lines, as well as check-call, check-bet. Data shows that most players tend to overfold against smaller c-bets, especially on boards like these ones. The overfold is quite small on average, but specifically when we look at high, super disconnected boards, that's when people really struggle to defend, and this is a spot where Big Blind can just gain so much EV by defending properly. To help you with this, I've also prepared some PowerPoint slides which describe how solver defends on various streets. Against a 30% pot bet on the flop, pairs always or almost always call in late positions, and also many semi-connected air hands call. The pairs are pretty intuitive. Note that if the board is more connected, or if it's a bigger c-bet, or if it's earlier positions, then those hands would be allowed to fold a little bit more often. But the air hands, I think, are much less intuitive. The annotation describes 10-7 of clubs specifically, and if we hover over to show combos and enable this one, you will see that this is a hand that has to defend at a pretty high frequency. Now, if you contrast that with something like King 9 of hearts, you will notice that solver does prefer 10-7 of clubs because it's a little bit more connected. And if we just look at a few other hands in the calling range, you'll see that Jack-10 with a diamond also defends a lot more often than King 9 suited, which really just points out that solver strongly prefers backdoor draws when defining its calling range. King 9 might seem a little bit stronger because the king is an overcard to the queen, but this just really details solver's preference for calling with the diamond, because this of course can make a backdoor flush. I think it's also really important to understand how often the solver raises, because another key exploit that Big Blind wants to take on the flop is to overraise both with value and with bluffs. The slide I have here states that on these high disconnected boards, good top pairs plus make up the bulk of the value raising range, and bluffs come from draws and weak pairs. The value range I think is pretty straightforward. Just note that as the board gets lower, more top pairs will raise for denial, and a greater chunk of Big Blind's raising range is also going to be made up of overpairs, especially in early positions where they have more hands like pocket jacks and pocket tens, and even some pocket queens. The bluff raises are much more difficult to find in my opinion, and we can narrow them down by heading over to the filters tab and simply selecting ace highs, king highs, and nothing hands. You'll see that the raising frequency is quite high with a lot of these junk combos like Jack 5 of clubs even, and generally I think most players will miss many of these semi-connected hands like Jack 5. 10-9 is another great example. If Big Blind is holding a diamond here, this has a nice backdoor flush draw and it has a backdoor straight draw. And also just note how often these lower connected cards are raising. This is a pretty common pattern to see on pretty much every single board in this formation, We also see this a lot in 3-bet pots. Essentially, these combos just have very nice blockers because in position doesn't have a lot of low hands in their range. And especially when they're holding like a flush draw or a straight draw, even if it's a gut shot, those hands raise often. The most important thing to note, however, is that big blind can't raise all of those hands at a 100% frequency. It certainly wouldn't be too obvious if big blind were to just raise 5-3 and 5-deuce and all this other junk at 100% frequency, but especially when they start over-raising with hands like 10-9 with just a diamond, or hands like Jack-5 of clubs, then the raising frequency can potentially skyrocket to something like 30 or 35% of the time. Exploitatively, big blind does want to over-raise, but they're only allowed to raise 15% of the time in theory, and I think getting this frequency above 20 to 25% is just going to be far too obvious. There are definitely some textures where exploitatively check raising makes more sense than others, and that's also something that's covered in this flagship course. So, final point about the flop, this is a spot where big blind wants to overcall, and they want to overraise for some reasons that we'll discuss later. Let's move on to our next annotation, which discusses Button's turn play. This is their turn strategy right over here, and this annotation states, this is a fairly neutral board for Button. Both players have plenty of strong hands, and the bulk of their value betting range are top pairs. As mentioned before, flush closing turns tend to be under-bluffed because it may be difficult to find weak bluffs like 10-9 of clubs that have to bluff very often. And this is a pretty big point, so before we even look at big blind's defending strategy, let's just examine it a little bit further. If we head over to the filters tab and we highlight the nothing hands and the ace high hands, we will see what hands Button has to bluff in order to stay indifferent. You'll notice that the overall betting frequency is quite high, and they're only checking around 35% of the time. Furthermore, if we examine which hands they have to bluff with, we'll find tons of weak hands that just have to bet. Hands like 9-7 of hearts, 9-7 of spades, there's a lot of these ace highs, and just generally every hand that doesn't have showdown value should bluff at some high frequency. Like I mentioned, when extrapolating results from mass data analysis, I like to focus on some very practical and reliable heuristics. And oh boy, does this spot reveal one of them. This is a pattern I want you to remember. In every single formation, bluff catching will almost always be worse in spots where the opposing player has to bluff very often. The idea is that while most players will find bluffs with flush draws, not everyone is going to find a bluff with a hand like 9-7 of hearts. On this specific board, Button is supposed to bluff very often. The average opponent, who already tends to be a bit too passive, will miss bluffs with these sorts of hands, which causes them to underbluff. And this, I think, is where mass data and theory interact in a very meaningful and useful way. Because if big blind is playing in a novel scenario that looks unfamiliar, but they understand theory well enough to realize that in position has to bluff at a very high frequency, then big blind would know that this spot is more likely to be under-bluffed than over-bluffed. And this sort of heuristic, I think, is just much more powerful than, for example, memorizing how often every single texture in every single line is bluffed by the population. With that said, let's clear our filters and we will head over to our next annotation, which describes how big blind should play. The note is on Queen 9 suited, and it states, because the bulk of big blind's flop calling range were Queen X, 6X, and 4X pairs, they are indifferent with them on the turn. Big blind can still overfold their second pairs in this spot, but should still call King X due to blockers and value domination. There's a few big points here. The first one just explains which hands are too strong to fold and which ones are indifferent. Against 75% pot, King X is just a little bit too strong to fold. If we head over to this EV tab, you can see that it's worth around 0.8 big blinds as a call. Against this very common bet sizing scheme of 30% flop and 75% turn, it's usually the case that top pairs will be a little bit too strong to fold, but of course this can vary a little bit depending on the specific board texture. Second pairs, however, are generally indifferent. If we click on Queen 9 and show combos, you'll see that Queen 9 of spades and Queen 9 of hearts are worth 0 big blinds as a call. In practice, big blind should definitely overfold those hands against most average opponents. Remember, the average opponent will bet a little bit too often on the river, and they will underbluff, so it's detrimental for the red line to simply call with this hand to fold it on a later street. But this raises another important point, especially in this case where second pairs were top pairs on the flop, and therefore big blind has very many of them on the turn. It would be pretty extreme for big blind to always fold their second pairs. If big blind were to fold all of these hands 100% of the time, then the folding frequency would skyrocket. especially because big blind is incentivized to overcall on the flop and thus naturally arrives at the turn with more hands that fold. My general recommendation is to not let this folding frequency go above 5 or 10% in most common spots. If this was a 3-bet pot or like a check raise line, then it's definitely fine to play much more exploitatively there because the spot's more rare and the pot is usually a lot bigger. But at the end of the day, simply because the spot is very common, it's a big mistake for big blind to play way too exploitatively and just overfold huge swath of their range. It would simply be too obvious, and I think most players would catch on as button. So big blind should definitely still call with some of those second pairs. I don't think the combos matter too much, but if big blind just wants to play like the solver, then they would prefer to bluff catch with something like queen 3 instead of queen 9. And that's because most of button's bluffs do come from this higher card region, which queen 9 blocks, but queen 3 unblocks. Just to quickly summarize the strategy before moving on, top pairs will usually call against 75% pot on the turn, unless it's a highly connected board. And also, weak pairs will call roughly 30% of the time. This point about weaker pairs is much more common on non-flush closing turns, and in this case, the solver is mostly calling with a pair if it also has a diamond. Still, you can see that there's a few hands like ace-6 in this range, and it's really not important to remember these. If big blind just wants to defend with some of their second pairs and better, that's totally fine. Let's clear our filters and move on to the next step. This is button's river strategy on the 6 of spades, which is a pairing card. Let's read the annotation. Solver doesn't bluff very often on the river, but data shows that regs still simply don't bluff often enough. As previously mentioned, that's in large part because most regs underbluff on the turn, which decreases the amount of bluffs they have on the river. Still, the most aggressive and stationary regs tend to overbluff on every texture. This highlights how practical strategies can differ significantly from solver solutions. Regs' bluffing tendencies on each street have compounding effects on how many bluffs they have on the river and how often they bet them. Let's dissect exactly what this means. If we head over to the filters tab once more and just select the nothing hands and ace high hands, you'll actually notice that the solver does not bluff very often on the 6 of spades. After all, this card does not improve many of button's bluffs. Button simply just arrives here with a lot of these hands like jack 10 and 9-8 and 10-7, which didn't even improve to a weaker pair. The solver has a lot of junk here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that players will. Remember in the previous turn annotation, we said that most in-position players will not find enough weak bluffs like 9-7 or 10-7. As a result, they would be allowed to bluff much more often on the river because they simply have less bluffs. That naturally makes it more difficult for the average player to overbluff in the spot. And as mentioned, mass data shows that bluff catching here is quite bad. And while it is pretty out of the ordinary for aggressive players to overbluff on turns like this one, I still think it's pretty reasonable to say that some hyper-aggressive players would either bluff roughly this amount or maybe even a little bit more. As a consequence, it would be quite easy for those players to actually overbluff on this river because solver's bluffing frequency is so low. If big blind is playing against one of those players, it's definitely more than fine for them to overcall. Let's move on to the final annotation in this example. We are now going to look at big blind's defending strategy. As with many river spots, against bet, big blind is indifferent with king x top pairs. But also notice, ace-6 is indifferent against a river overbet. That's because the bulk of button's value betting range at this size consists of flushes. In practice, big blind can overfold even those hands against most opponents. Very simply, the average opponent is going to underbluff on pretty much every single texture, and that certainly includes this one. There's not too much to discuss here besides understanding which hands are indifferent. In this PowerPoint, I state that against 150% pot on the river, top pairs will usually be indifferent as calls. Also, solver often calls around 10 to 30% of weak pairs with good bluff catching properties. This bottom point about weak pairs isn't really that important in practice. It's nice to know that solver sometimes does it, but big blind usually wants to play a little bit more binary on the river and simply overcall if they think their opponent bluffs too much, or overfold against most opponents who do not bluff often enough. Another point I want to throw out is that there's not too much of a risk for big blind massively overfolding and thus becoming too predictable in the spot. If big blind is playing well, then they are already overfolding on the turn, and thus they have a stronger range coming into the river. Thus, it's much harder for them to overfold significantly too often. In addition, because the spot is more rare and the pot is bigger, it's fine for big blind to play a bit more exploitatively here and simply always fold their bluff catchers or always call their bluff catchers, depending on how they think the in-position player is playing. I mean, I guess if they want to mix up the strategy every now and then, that's totally fine too, but don't make it a habit. Let's now move on to our second example, the high connected flop. Big blind generally wants to defend much tighter on these boards, and we'll see exactly why shortly. The board in question is Queen Jack 10 9 deuce, and big blind is now facing a big flop c-bet from button. That has some important strategic implications, which we'll discuss. But first, let's take a look at this annotation. The focus is on Queen 7, which is a marginal top pair. The annotation says, solver folds very often against 75% pot on triple Broadway boards like this one. Button has a big range advantage, and very few hands have enough equity to call. This is a board texture we have to be careful on. Data shows regs bet too often on the turn on double and triple Broadway boards. In addition, they bet too often in bet check bet, but still overfold against check call check bet. As mentioned in the article, we want to overfold against large flop c-bets. So the annotation definitely makes things very clear. On average, in position regs will barrel roughly at the correct frequency on the turn, but this frequency increases on certain textures like this one, or when in position uses a larger flop c-bet. Larger flop bets also tend to be bluffed less often. Due to all of these negative factors, big blind wants to overfold right away. Just like it's a mistake for big blind to call with a weak hand on the turn to fold it on the river, in this case it would be a mistake for big blind to call with a weaker top pair, only to then fold it on the turn. The annotation is specifically on Queen 7 to point out that top pairs are not strong against this bet. The defending threshold is pretty much just pair plus draw and better. How big blind wants to defend with check raises here is a little bit more interesting. Even though this texture highly favors in position, big blind is still raising around 11% of the time. And data shows this is a spot where a lot of players under-bluff raise. You might think that it's not a good bluff raising spot with something like King 3, but this is actually a misconception. Believe it or not, in-position players will tend to overfold on almost every single texture against the check raise bet line, even if they use a large flop c-bet. If players c-bet big, they will tend to over-defend on the flop and on the turn, but there's still a big overfold on almost all river textures. There's only a few big board types that are over-defended. I'm not going to talk too much about raises in this masterclass, that's something that's available in this course over at Savant, but I just want you to remember that bluffing in check raise bet is a bit better than most players think, even on boards that look dangerous like this one. So, just to summarize it quickly, on high connected boards against 75% pot, pairs usually need a draw to call, some weaker pairs will occasionally bluff catch, and of course big blind is incentivized to overfold because players will barrel too often, etc. Let's move on to our next annotation covering turn play. This is a really interesting turn card because it does make 4 straight. Annotation here says wet boards tend to be under-bluffed in general. Regs are supposed to check 1/3 of their straights here, and typically don't check them enough. Just as importantly, they're supposed to bluff almost half the time with weak pairs and trash. This is a very bad board for bluff catching. One more point I want to add to this annotation is that mass data shows that regs tend to underbluff when they use larger flop c-bets, so similar to what we talked about earlier, players will not have enough bluffs on the turn, which makes it even more difficult for them to bluff at the correct frequency. Bluff catching against pretty much any reg is going to be quite bad in this spot. But let's take a look at big blind defense. Solver is indifferent with top pair plus flush draws, and even some king x straights against the overbet. That's because button only really overbets with ace king. In practice, big blind can just call their king x straights and fold everything else. They probably don't want to fold king x straights because some regs might overbet with their own king x straights instead of just ace king. I think the explanation is quite clear here. Because the spot is so bad for bluff catching, and the pot is pretty big, as in position used bigger bets than in the previous example, I don't think this is a spot where big blind really has to call with weaker hands in order to appear more balanced. It's simply very negative ED to call with something like Queen 7, and the risk of getting counter exploited is pretty low because in position is already supposed to bluff at a very high frequency with all sorts of unintuitive hands. Let's move on to the next annotation. This is now button's river strategy. Buttons should jam very often in this line. They're bluffing frequently, with most of the bluffs coming from weak area hands like 7-6 suited. Big blind should fold their king x straights against most regs versus a jam, but let's see what happens if they just bet 75% pot. Let's have a look. Solver calls all king x straights against a river bet, but as we discussed, this is one of the worst textures to bluff catch. Even so, these hands are worth over 30 big blinds in EVS calls, and therefore it would simply be a mistake to fold. I think it summarizes it quite well. Big blind is not overfolding on this river because they simply don't have anything to overfold with, and that's totally fine. I don't have too much more to add here. As a quick recap, on high connected boards, the turn calling strategy is highly dependent on the specific card. Often, 2 pairs are indifferent, but sometimes straights and even flushes are indifferent. At this point, I also like to think that the optimal strategy is very detached from the solver strategy, simply because most players are deviating highly themselves. On the river, the calling strategy is highly dependent on the specific runout. Usually, whatever big blind called with most on the turn will be indifferent on the river. If the board is less connected and a smaller bet size is used, then usually that hand class will be top pairs. Very simply, if big blind arrives at the river holding mostly top pairs, then those top pairs will usually be indifferent against a river bet. So keep that in mind, and you'll find it much easier to navigate tricky rivers. And those are all the examples we'll cover for our discussion of texture. If you want to learn more and really master your big blind defense, then I highly encourage you to check out the course on Savant. You can try it out for free, and if you feel inclined to buy, the price is absolutely phenomenal. There is already a lot of content on the site, and there is much more coming. Let's now move on to our second factor for bluff catching, in positions bet size. Personally, I find bet sizing tells to be one of the most insightful things from all of mass data analysis. When you know what to look for, it's almost like you're picking up on information you didn't know was there. But just like when factoring in texture, we don't want to look at bet size too closely and sort of box ourselves in from making good decisions. There's going to be some really good examples demonstrating this in this section. To start off, I have another fun little quote. This one writes, "When they go big, they're either strong or compensating for something." This one's from Dr. Cbets, author of The Psychology of Overbets. The way I want to get through this section is to just look at a few common bet sizing schemes, and then we'll get to those examples and talk nuance and all that fun stuff. So let's get to it. After in position uses 30% flop, there are a few common patterns that they will use. The first one I have listed is bet 30 on the flop, bet 30 on the turn, and bet 75 on the river. This one is neutral for bluff catching. Usually, when in-position players use a smaller bet size on the turn, they will have more bluffs in that range. This actually goes for a lot of different formations, not just SRP IPPFR. For example, if our opponent is instead playing from the big blind and we're playing as in position, they will overbluff for that size if they have the opportunity to bet on the turn. This could happen if we decide to check on the flop and then they decide to stab on the turn. In that same line, if they use a larger turn bet, like 75% pot or 150% pot, they will usually underbluff a little bit for that size. So smaller turn bets across the game tree tend to be a little bit weaker. That's why this one's neutral for bluff catching. Next up is probably the most common bet size from in position in this line. This is bet 30, bet 75, and bet 75. No surprise here, there is a medium underbluff. Bet is a bit underbluff on average, and this is the most common bet size, so this makes intuitive sense. And last up is one that is a little bit more rare, but I feel like maybe it's becoming a bit more common. This is bet 30 on the flop, overbet on the turn, and overbet on the river. You might be surprised to find out that there is actually a small overbluff in this line. Usually when people face overbets, they suspect that those will be bluffed less often than smaller bets. But here, this simply isn't the case. I do have a very important note about this one, however, which is why it's italicized and there's that little marker there. And this is the fact that player type is extremely important when ranging overbets. Data shows that the more passive players will absolutely underbluff for this size. More aggressive players, however, will overbluff when they use it. Just by the numbers, more aggressive players tend to overbet more often, and thus data shows that on average, this bet sizing scheme is slightly overbluffed. Passive players do not use this bet size all that often, and they underbluff when they use it. So although it is fine to bluff catch against aggressive players when they overbet, it would certainly be a mistake to do that against a more passive regular. Let's move on to the next slide, which covers a few bet sizing schemes when in position uses 50% on the flop. This first scheme is a little bit rare, but it still sometimes happens. This is bet 50 on the flop, 50 on the turn, and 50 on the river. Mass data shows that there is a big underbluff for this size. Likewise, when in position uses 50% on the flop, 75 on the turn, and 75 on the river, there is also a big underbluff. However, just like in the previous slide, turn and river overbets are slightly overbluffed on average. Again, this has everything to do with player type. Let's move on to our last slide. This covers 75 and 125% flop. Starting with 75% flop, there are two main schemes I want to look at. The first one is bet 75, bet 75, bet 75, and there is also a big under-bluff here. However, there is yet another small overbluff if overbets are used on the turn and river. Same reasons as before, no need to cover them again. Last but not least, let's see what happens after in position overbets. Here, they're using 125 on the flop, 150 on the turn, and 150 on the river. According to the data, another small overbluff. This final sizing scheme is incredibly rare, however, and honestly, I think this one's very texture dependent. For example, how often in position is allowed to bluff when they c-bet for 125% flop depends a lot on the board texture. Solver overbets pretty often on something like 10-7 deuce, but it is not allowed to bluff that much simply because most of in position's range just misses this board. If we head over to the filters tab, we can really see this in action. Just gonna highlight the ace highs, the king highs, and the nothing hands. You can see that solver is only betting them around 40% of the time. In other spots, in position is not allowed to bluff nearly as often. For example, in earlier positions when ranges are tighter, in position is supposed to bluff very often on higher boards. We're looking at King Queen 3 Rainbow, and assuming that in position decides to overbet here, they actually have to bluff very often. We can head over to the filters tab and select the ace highs and the nothing hands, and in this spot they're supposed to bet 75% of the time. Clearly that's much higher than the lower board, and this mainly occurs because the high board interacts so well with in position's range. Last point I want to mention before we move on is to just generally be careful against this flop overbet line. It's really rare, so even a few statistical outliers can really skew the population average. Another point I really want to stress is that river overbets can mean vastly different things in different spots. For example, let's go back to the first board we looked at. This is Queen 6 4 King 6. We already examined Button's river bluffing strategy in this spot, and we paid close attention to the fact that they were not allowed to bluff very often. This was a spot where their range missed. If Big Blind is facing an overbet from an aggressive player on this board, most likely the best move is to call down. They have all of these hands that they could quite easily overbluff, and it also makes sense that aggressive players would want to overbluff here. If we just put ourselves in position's shoes, it's easy for them to put Big Blind on a hand like King X and just overbet with the intention to get the average passive opponent to throw away their hand. The bluff just makes sense. If we head over to the other board we looked at earlier, the story I think is quite different. This is Button's river strategy on the high connected board, which ran out as Queen Jack 10 9 deuce. The annotation stated that Button should jam very often in this line, primarily because they have a big nut advantage here. Specifically, they are holding the nut straight, ace-king, which Big Blind never has. Even if an aggressive player jams here, I do not think they would be bluffing often enough. The reason is that the bluff doesn't make a lot of logical sense. I think it's fairly easy for in-position players to understand that if they jam, Big Blind will be indifferent with their King X straights. Generally speaking, I think that most regs, even aggressive ones, would agree with me when I say that bluffing against a strong range is not a great play. If we put ourselves in position's shoes and have something like 7-6 here, I simply find it very difficult to justify this move. I just feel like most players wouldn't bluff here because they'd expect to get called down by King X too often. I looked at the solution, and Big Blind should only call their King X around 50% of the time, so it's pretty easy for them to overcall. If Big Blind is facing an all-in jam here, then no, I don't think they should bluff catch. I think the in-position jam is a trap regardless of player type. I could be wrong, but I've had much more success abandoning mass data in these niche spots. So that covers overbets, but we also saw one other bet sizing pattern. You can see it if I quickly flip through these slides. Data shows that the average player will underbluff significantly more when they use a larger flop cbet. Data shows they tend to barrel too often on the turn, so it's best practice to simply overfold on the flop if in position c-bet's big. And that's it for this section. Hopefully you found it as insightful as I did, and with that said, let's move on to opponent profile. The quote I have here says, "Never trust a man with 80% VPIP and a dream." from Coach GTO moments before deviating. And this is definitely true, but of course, we are focusing on the reg strategy today. We talked a little bit about opponent profile and how it interacts with the other factors all throughout the video, but I do think there's a few extra points that are worth mentioning. First and foremost, it's important to understand that opponent profile matters more in specific spots. This point is often overlooked. Usually when people are thinking about bluff catching, they will assume that the impact of player profile will be roughly equal across all spots. But data shows that this is not the case. In fact, there are some spots where almost all player types tend to overbluff, and there are spots where almost all player types tend to vastly underbluff. I've created a 1 to 5 point system which evaluates how good a bluff catching spot is against different player types. The way this one works is I've broken down the reg profile into 5 sub-profiles based on how often they bluff post-flop. Those sub-profiles range from least bluffy to most bluffy. So one sub-profile will tend to underbluff a lot on average, another one will tend to underbluff a little bit, one will bluff close to neutral, etc. And then we simply see how often these different player types will bluff in a particular spot. For every subtype that overbluffs, we give that spot a point. Bet has a score of 1 out of 5 points. This means that out of the 5 reg subtypes, there was only one group that overbluffed in the spot. So everybody except for the hyper-aggressive regs underbluffed the spot on average. Contrast that with bet, which is another very common line in this formation. Bet has 2.5 points out of 5. This means that 2 groups overbluffed the spot, and 1 group bluffed it roughly at the right frequency, which is why it gets half a point. Clearly, bet is a much worse spot for bluff catching. Next up, I want to point out that opponent profile has a greater impact on certain textures. We already looked at a few examples of this earlier, but I have one more that I'd like to add. For this one, we're actually going to head over to a premium module from this Savant course, and we're going to dive into this article titled After They Cbet. In this article, I provide an example spot, Ace Queen 5-7, where I believe most players will underbluff regardless of player profile. This is under the gun's turn strategy after range betting on the flop for a small size. And there are 2 very important points about this annotation. First of all, the board is very high and it interacts very well with in position's range. It gives them tons of value, like strong top pairs, 2 pairs, and sets, and it also blocks most of their natural bluffs. They definitely have some hands like King Jack and King 10 that bet at a high frequency, but many of their bluffs will come from weaker pairs, even as strong as pocket jacks. It's fairly easy for players to find bluffs like King 10 or Jack 10, but it's much more difficult for them to find bluffs like pocket jacks, pocket 10s, and all of these weaker pairs. The second point is that in position is actually not allowed to bet a lot of their strong top pairs. Big Blind's range is very condensed to these top pairs after calling the flop Cbet. Therefore, these hands are a little bit weaker and also have to check to defend the weaker pairs in position's range. Solver prefers to overbet, but I'd say it's a bit more common for players to bet 75% pot in position. If they're betting 75% pot, most likely they are barreling too often with Ace 10, Ace 9, and Ace 8. That further skews their range towards value, even if, by some miracle, they are bluffing at the correct frequency. Regardless of player type, bluff catching here will be bad. If we interact with the solution and click right over here, we can see Big Blind's defending strategy. They are supposed to be indifferent with Ace 10, Ace 9, and Ace 8. But because most players underbluff, it's totally fine for Big Blind to just throw away these hands. However, if Big Blind has a specific read that under the gun is value betting a bit too thin with their Ace 9 and Ace 8, then Ace 10 can definitely be a fine call. There's one more turn example I want to look at from this premium section. This is still under the gun versus Big Blind, and the board is Ace 6 deuce, 8 deuce. The annotation is on Ace Queen, and it says, "This isn't one of those turn spots where in position has to dig deep to find bluffs. That usually happens on really high boards where their Broadway junk is blocked. But it is a board where they aren't able to value bet many hands. Look at how often even strong top pairs are checking. It's really easy for regs to barrel these hands too often, which helps explain the big underbluff we see in the data. This points out that bluffing isn't the only thing you want to consider when it comes to player type. How often the specific player type bluffs matters a lot, but what's equally important is how often this player type value bets. If they're value betting too thin, like most players would be in this spot, then bluff catching will become worse. And that's pretty much it for opponent profile. Before we move on, I want to highly stress that this is a crucial factor for decision making. In my experience professionally playing and coaching, I found that player profile is one of the last things many players will consider. But clearly, it has a very big impact, and it's highly linked to many other factors like texture and bet size. Big blind should think about this one every step of the way. And with that said, we have now officially covered our first step to big blind mastery. By now, you should have a very good understanding of exactly where bluff catching is good and where bluff catching is bad. If you want to learn more, check out the Savant course. But next up, I want to talk about 3 more game plan hacks for big blind mastery. These game plan hacks are all centered around fixing mistake number 3 from the start of the video. This is something that absolutely devastates many players' red lines, and it is not fighting back often enough, both in check call, check bet, and with flop check raises. We're going to cover 3 quick actionable tips specifically focused around fighting back as big blind. The first one is to overcall and overcheck raise against small flop Cbets. I write about it in the second module of the Savant course, but very broadly speaking, defending against small flop Cbets is going to be higher EV than it is in the solver because in position players make 2 big mistakes. The first mistake they make is they do not bet nearly often enough in bet check bet. Because regs don't do this often enough, big blind's medium strength and weak hands have an easier time getting to showdown after in-position checks on the turn. The second mistake that in-position players make is overfolding considerably against check call check bet. And this is where most of big blind's fighting back happens. In essence, mass data shows that in-position players will not c-bet far too often on the turn. They will check on the turn at roughly the correct frequency. After they do check, however, they will overfold considerably against check call check bet. And so it becomes optimal for big blind to overcall on the flop against small flop Cbets in order to take this check call check bet bluffing line. Or at the very least, simply check back on the river and not face bet check bet often enough. Likewise, check raising on the flop, especially against smaller Cbets, is a great bluffing move. Data shows regs overfold against check raise bet bet, even if they use larger flop Cbets. There is a bit more nuance specifically when it comes to check raising, and we'll actually cover a little bit of that in our second and third game plan hacks. But with all of this information in mind, let's have a look at what a practical strategy might look like. This is a new button versus big blind spot. We're looking at big blind's defending strategy against a 30% c-bet on queen, 10, 7, 9, queen. You can go through these annotations on your own by following the link down below, so I'm not going to do that. But the main thing I want to point out is that big blind doesn't want to overcall or overraise way too much on the flop, because then their strategy would be far too obvious. Big blind might want to overcall on this flop by anywhere between 5 to 10%. Anything more than that just becomes too predictable. Same thing goes for the raises. Especially against 30% pot, big blind will have tons of hands in their range that are able to raise at a low frequency. This includes hands like flush draws, but also a lot of weak pairs like 7-5. My general recommendation is to increase the raising frequency of these hands to something like 30 to 40%, but not much more than that. But let's head over to the turn and talk about some interesting strategy there. This turn spot isn't anything too crazy. It's fairly connected, but there's no flush closing. It's not something like 4th straight either. So I think the strategy for button here is fairly intuitive. One point worth mentioning is that players generally tend to check a little bit too often with mergey hands. These would be hands like King 10, which have a pair plus draw, or pocket jacks, or maybe even something like Queen Jack suited. It's not a massive chunk of in positions range from late positions, but in early positions, these sort of mergey bets become a little bit more common, and the average player misses most of them. So when in position checks, just be aware that they will have more of these medium strength pairs in their range. That can have a few strategic implications. For instance, if we look at big blind's river betting strategy after in-position checks, you'll notice that all of their 10x are able to value bet for a small size. Value betting with these hands is clearly far worse if button is holding more hands like pocket jacks and king 10 and queen jack, which of course beat the 10x. Also, if button overfolds against check call check bet, then value betting becomes even worse. For this value bet with 10x to be the right move here, button actually has to call with tons of weaker hands. If we look at their defending strategy and head over to the filters tab, you'll see that they're calling with a lot of their 9x, with some of their low pairs, and a decent number of their ace highs as well. Data shows that the overfold against check call check bet is truly massive. If we referred back to our 5-point system from earlier, this would be classified as a 4 to a 4.5 point bluffing spot. This means that pretty much every single reg subtype except for the very most stationy players are massively overfolding here. That's why check call check bet is such an important line, and that's why big blind defense can have a massive impact on your red line. Bluffing in check call check bet is also quite simple. If we head back over to big blind and hover over their bluffs, you can actually see that out of position is supposed to bluff almost 100% of the time in this spot. And that's pretty true for most rivers. Essentially, what's happening here is out of position doesn't have all that many bluffs after calling a Cbet. Especially on a higher and more connected flop like this one, big blind is supposed to fold with most of their air. They need bluffs on the river, they don't hold many of them, so they simply bluff 100% of the time. However, in some other spots, big blind will actually have a bit more air on the river, and therefore their bluffing frequency will be a bit lower than 100%. Also, just note that if big blind plans on overcalling on the flop in order to take check call check bet, then they will arrive with more bluffs here, and if they're not value betting thin enough with their 10x for example, their range would be further skewed towards bluffs. It's not a massive risk by any means, because the spot is simply so good for bluffing. It is worth 4.5 points, which is huge. My practical recommendation is for big blind to simply bluff 100 or close to 100% of the time in the spot. Next up, let's take a look at our second and third game plan hacks. Both of these are related to check raising. Starting off with number 2, delay value check raise against bigger flop Cbets. This fully has to do with the fact that the average opponent will barrel too often on the turn if they Cbet big. If we again take a look at big blind's defending strategy on Queen Jack 10, you'll notice that all of their strong hands are indifferent between calling and raising. Something like Queen Jack is actually only supposed to raise 30% of the time. And the same thing goes for the strongest hands in big blind's range, like King 9. Delaying these raises until the turn is usually the smartest move. If big blind raises right away, players will typically overdefend on the flop and on the turn if they Cbet big, but they will overfold on the river. As mentioned, check raise bet bet is a great bluffing line, even if in position Cbets big. However, if big blind simply calls, they will encounter a turn barrel too often, and the subsequent turn check raise will be overdefended. Therefore, it's just a more efficient line for getting value. Texture can have a bit of an impact though, because players tend to barrel at different frequencies on different textures. We mentioned a few times earlier that players barrel too often on double and triple Broadway boards, but there are 3 textures I want you to know where players barrel a little bit less often. The first texture is the single Broadway board. For example, it is King 8-3 Rainbow. The second texture is the low disconnected board, something like 10-8-3. And lastly is the pair board, which is something like 9-9 deuce. On these boards, it's a little bit better to check raise right away. As a side point, this also ties into our first game plan hack, which was for big blind to overcall against small flop Cbets. Overcalling in order to take check call check bet is better in spots where in position does not barrel too often on the turn. On these textures, in position players will barrel the least often, so overcalling on the flop becomes even better. Last up is game plan hack number 3. If big blind does check raise, the best value line is usually check raise check raise. This further ties into the check raising strategy, which is discussed in depth in this third module of the course. Let's jump into a big blind versus button spot. This is 10-7 deuce 5-4. On the flop, button Cbet small, big blind check raise for 50% pot, and now big blind is deciding to bet or check on the turn. The annotation we have is on King 6 suited, which is a flush. Big blind's strongest hands are usually indifferent towards checking or betting on the turn, but big blind prefers to check in order to take check raise check raise. Regs overstab on the turn and overdefend a little bit, which allows big blind to build the pot quickly. Don't expect this to work all the time though, as it is a very rare line. If we head over to button strategy after big blind checks, we can see exactly why this is the case. Many regs stab with their entire range facing a check, helping explain the overstab. Another possible explanation is that regs have a stronger range overall here due to overfolding on the flop, which makes it easy for them to bet too often with hands like top pairs. Either way, the idea behind going for this check raise line is that big blind is giving button the opportunity to bet too often with their hands like ace 10, king 10, and queen 10. If big blind barrels on the turn, then these would be hands that most players overfold. But by checking, big blind gives button the opportunity to bet them, thus extracting a little bit more value with strong hands. And that is all I have in this video for the 3 game plan hacks. If you're interested in a little bit of a deeper dive into the check raise strategy, as well as a few more check raising secrets, then definitely join the Discord down below, which has the free video that follows up on this exact topic. And of course, I highly encourage you to get this Savant course. The fact that you're watching this video up until this point shows me that you appreciate the content. And I have to sincerely thank you because I have been working unbelievably hard. This YouTube video is meant to give you a glimpse of what Savant offers. Right now, for an extremely good price in my opinion, you can get access to almost 20 hours of high-value educational content. You also get 8 additional hours every single month, as well as access to regular group coaching calls with recordings. I really don't know what to say besides the fact that at this current price, it feels like we're almost giving everything away. When you compare Savant to $1,000 video courses, it's not even close. Our prices are only going to increase in the future as we add more content and more features, so right now is the best time to get access. Plus, from the business side of things, it helps us make more videos, hire more coaches, and develop new features. To maximize your learning, each Savant course is packed with over 200 annotated solutions and drills. Each module also has several quizzes, which feature explanations to maximize your learning. You can try all of our flagship courses, including this one for free before you buy. We have just expanded to many more countries and regions. And if you'd like to see your country added, please shoot us an email. Follow the link down below to learn advanced poker the best way possible.